Well, I thought I'd do something a little interesting in this video. Let's go ahead and take a look at what the Red Tide South map looks like when it's combined with the Red Tide West maps. And for those of you that are familiar with the Red Tide West game, you know that Red Tide West is two maps, and they take up a fair amount of table space for a magazine war game. But it's two maps, and with Red Tide South, that'll make it a third map. Now, very conspicuously, you can see that the edge of the Red Tide South map, right along here, gets in the way of the Red Tide West South map. And that's okay because my recommendation is to go ahead and actually get your ruler and an X-Acto knife and cut right along here and maybe right along this way, and maybe kind of cut up diagonally about here or so like. This is all just kind of a placeholder on the Red Tide South map, and that's just to kind of show you where it mates up with Red Tide West. But of course, all of this is completely unnecessary for Red Tide South. It's really, as I say, just kind of a placeholder so that you know where the map goes. But there are some new terrain features that are not on the Red Tide West South map, such as some of these forests and stuff like that. And the mountain depiction right along here, this is much more accurate on this map than it was on the Red Tide West South map. So if you actually cut right along here, right about that way, and I don't know, maybe kind of cut up like that along the plane of the Austrian-German border, you'll have the most accurate terrain about this way, and of course you can cut down like that and you'll get rid of this little border thing. I know it's a pain to have to cut maps and all of that, and this is just one of those weird things because Red Tide South came out so much later than Red Tide West. If I had designed these things all at the same time, that would have been one thing, but those are the limitations of magazine games. When I designed Red Tide West, I had no idea at that time that there was going to be a Red Tide South, but here we are. So altogether, we got a pretty cool combined game, I think, and there's a lot of possibilities. So, but anyway, while we're here and while we're talking about Red Tide West, I want to go over a couple of issues that seems to dog the Red Tide West game, and I figured this was the perfect opportunity to kind of discuss some of the points that you may be aware of. Now, in the first place, Red Tide West, it's one of those strange games that is either loved or hated. And some of the criticisms of Red Tide West are valid, I have to say. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So I'm not one of those overly defensive designers who cannot brook any criticism of his game. Some of the criticisms are valid. Some are not valid, though. Some of the criticisms are simply inaccurate. So I'll go ahead and touch on those. But if you're interested in Red Tide West and you haven't played it, go ahead and pay attention because we'll touch on some of the finer points in terms of what people liked about the game and what people didn't like about the game, and you can kind of draw your own conclusions. Most importantly, the issues that I decided were actually problems in Red Tide West, I fixed in Red Tide South. And you can actually retroactively apply these fixes from Red Tide South to a Red Tide West game, and that should alleviate pretty much most of the concerns that most gamers had. For example, one of the complaints about Red Tide West was the lack of SAMs in terms of land combat. Now, SAMs are represented when you want to go bomb targets. You want to bomb a bridge or an airbase or something like that, or a munitions target. There are SAMs galore, and the SAMs are very potent, in fact, and pretty deadly. So, the SAMs are represented in all their glory. However, when it comes to actual land combat, the complaint has been made that SAMs don't really feature prominently enough. And we're talking about like mobile SA6s or chaparrals or whatever. So I thought, that's kind of valid, and maybe the thing to do is to kind of add a SAM rule or a SAM mechanic. And without actually adding a whole new rule, what I did is I actually added a SAM result to the combat results table. So formally on the combat results table for Red Tide West and also for Red Tide South, there was a no effect column, like a dash on the CRT, and you may have seen it in some of the other videos. Well, now what I did is I added a bracketed S result, and if that happens, that means that a SAM result has actually occurred and an air unit is shot down. So I thought that went a long way in a very elegant way to addressing that concern. One of the other concerns, and I would say probably the biggest concern about Red Tide West, was that the Western Air Forces were allegedly way overpowered. Now, that is true in a certain respect, but in another respect, what happened is during the design process, I think what I did is I designed a mechanic that wasn't understood, and not that it should have been explained in the rules, but it was one of those things that I kind of assumed that players would figure out. But I think it was a little too esoteric, and so that's my fault for not making it clear. Well, what am I talking about? Okay, so in air combat, when you've got anywhere on the map where you've got Warsaw Pact air fighting with NATO air, the NATO air rolls 2 6-sided dice, Warsaw Pact air rolls 1 10-sided dice, and whoever gets the higher result wins. And of course, Warsaw Pact air, by and large, is not as effective in terms of quality as NATO air. So you add that to the differential that you get from 1 10-sided die and 2 6-sided dice, and NATO air tends to win out. Well, that was intentional. There was no mistake as far as that goes. But the Soviets, in particular, have a lot more air than NATO. But what was happening in the game is that the NATO air forces were still dominating the war in West Germany. They were just that much better. And the intent in the design was that the Warsaw Pact, true to Soviet doctrine, was supposed to send a lot of their air units across the map and suppress the various NATO air bases where NATO air units are based. And in doing that, they would get a lot of these air units shot down most of the time, especially against some of the more qualitative NATO air units. But that would free up the rest of the Warsaw Pact air units to dominate the land war. Now, this is not just theory or conjecture. This is actually a viable tactic, and I've used it in games that I've played, and it works. It doesn't mean that the Warsaw Pact is going to win the game, and it also doesn't mean that the Warsaw Pact Air Force is going to last very long. In fact, they're still going to get shot down. But what was happening was Warsaw Pact players were seeing the entire Red Air Force get shot down by turn 3 or so, because they were trying to take on NATO air toe-to-toe, and not only were they losing toe-to-toe, but they weren't attaining air supremacy over a combat hex. So it was kind of a double whammy. But if the NATO player has all his air units suppressed, because the Warsaw Pact keeps launching these crummy air units to fly over and threaten to bomb their air bases, which of course forces the NATO air units to fly in defense, and keeps the best NATO air units tied up, then the Warsaw Pact Air Forces have a free range during their initial drive. And that's just enough to really kind of unhinge NATO on the ground. One of the last Red Tide West games I played as the Soviets. I employed this tactic as it was designed and is true to Soviet doctrine. That's exactly what the Soviets intended to do. It worked pretty well, and the game came down to the last turn, and it came down to the last die roll. So, But this little nuance was missed by a lot of new players who, of course, being traditional wargamers by and large, what they tended to do was try to fight air combat toe-to-toe, and of course they started to see Warsaw Pact air units die off in droves. So obviously that wasn't the design intent, and so I take full responsibility for not making that much more clear in the rules, but I did want you to know that there is a method to the madness. However, better than that, even better than that, for those of you that are still not convinced, if you're still not convinced, what I did is I did a complete redesign of the air combat system in Red Tide South, and you can port that over, and in fact it even says so in the rules, you can port that over to Red Tide West, and that will even things in the air much better. So for those of you that were doubting Thomases about Red Tide West and maybe missed the nuance about suppressing NATO airfields and all that, give the game another try. Try out the new air combat rules. I think they will satisfy perceptions and things like that. So, you know, there's a real gem hidden here in this game, Red Tide West. I think it's one of the better designs. Now, you know, this is a magazine game, and this is one of those special editions that that Decision Games did, and they're not doing the special editions anymore because it was too much work. One extra map, a whole extra counter sheet. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it really exponentially added to the design effort. So, but what we've got here is we've got a magazine game that had to be kind of crammed into the normal schedule of game production, but in fact it's really kind of a mini monster game. So insofar as that it was a mini monster game, there were certain things that we couldn't include, like, for example, conspicuously, the Czechs. And there they are in Red Tide South. We have the Czechs. So there's been some controversy about the Czechs. Why aren't the Czechs in the game? How come there are no Czechoslovakian units? And I spoke endlessly on various forums about why there's no Czechs and stuff like that. And, you know, I think there's a pretty convincing argument based on RAND studies and whatever. You know, the Czechs would have very potentially, possibly tried to avoid becoming involved in a war if war broke out. But we don't have to have that argument anymore because there are, in fact, Czech units that are included with Red Tide South, and you get the whole array, and you can include them or not include them or whatever your philosophy is. I say include them because, hey, they're included in Red Tide South, and we got to play with these bad boys, right? So, you know, that argument is essentially, it's kind of irrelevant now because we got the Czech units. We didn't have the counter space in Red Tide West to include the Czechs, but with Red Tide South, we've got the Czechs. And also, by the way, you can notice there are some extra units, errata units, and some bonus units and things like that for Red Tide West. So now, okay, we're gonna have the Czechs in Red Tide West now, and that's cool. To address a couple of points about alleged order of battle inaccuracies in the game, I want to tell you, absolutely, there was a couple and maybe a few, by which I mean that literally a few counter errors, and there was a missing unit here or there. But aside from that, don't believe the naysayers. The order of battle was exceptionally accurate. When a lot of the complaints started to come in about the order of battle because there was a missing unit here or there, which were legitimate complaints because a unit did get dropped out somehow or whatever, I went ahead and I double-checked all the order of battle for every nation and found out to be not only accurate, it's impeccably accurate. So take a look at the Czechs, for example. Those are absolutely accurate. Have no doubt about it. Have complete faith that this Czechoslovakian order of battle for the late 80s is absolutely accurate. Now, the Czechs underwent a reorganization in the late 80s, and that kind of confused things a little bit. But for our purposes, this order of battle reflects the latest purely Warsaw Pact Czechoslovakian order of battle for the game. So have no worries. This order of battle is exactly accurate. If anybody comes along and says, oh, it's not accurate because of this, and it's not accurate because of that, or it's not accurate because it doesn't reflect the post-1987 reorganization or whatever they want to say, don't worry about it. This is spot on. So anyway, there you go. That is Red Tide West and Red Tide South. I think I've covered everything. About the only other thing worth mentioning, and I want to cut this short because we're already past 15 minutes, there was a post about the viability of the Soviets actually being able to roll through Yugoslavia in the late 80s, and whether or not that was realistic, and the Yugoslavians allowing it and not resisting the Soviets. And there's some really good arguments why I don't believe that would have ever happened. In the first place, I don't think the Yugoslavians would have wanted to have been a part of World War III, especially with nukes flying around all over the place. I think if the Russians started coming out of Hungary, especially going into Slovenia, which, of course, the Yugoslavs didn't really care for, and that was evidenced by the fact that there was a war in the early 90s called the 10-Day War, where Slovenia fought for its independence. There was no love lost between the Belgrade government and Slovenia. And if the Russians were rolling out of Hungary and coming right through here, I don't think the Yugoslavians would have cared a whit. So I think there's every good reason to believe that the Yugoslavians would have stayed out of this war with all alacrity. I think they would have avoided it at all costs, and because they got really nothing to gain. And in fact, if you really want to talk about what the Yugoslavians might have gained from a war, Trieste was taken away from them after World War I and given to the Italians as a reward for the Italian participation on the Allied side during the war. And, that's always stuck in the craw of the Yugoslavians. And, there are still a lot of ethnic Yugoslavians in Trieste to this day, and especially at that time. And, one could make the argument that they would have loved to have seen the Russians come through here, knock the Italians back, and Russians probably would have made a deal, let us on through, we'll give you Trieste back, whatever. So, anyway. All right. I think I covered everything, and I think when we get this Red Tide South game out in early 2019, and we get a game combined with Red Tide West, I think it's really going to be fabulous. We're going to have the checks. We've got an accurate order of battle. We've got a new air combat rule. We've got additional Soviet air units. We've got errata units. We've got bonus units. I think anything of the few units that were legitimately missing from Red Tide West are now included. And I think I cleared up any holes in the rules. In the end, I think what we've got here is a really, really solid game. Once Red Tide South comes out and you get that set of extra counters, and even if you don't play with Red Tide South as a combined game, just to get the extra bonus and errata counters for Red Tide West, I think, and also the errata, I think it's going to be fabulous. So I hope that'll be a pinnacle of World War III games for years to come.